The morning of November 16, 1940, dawned cold and gray over Warsaw. At dozens of checkpoints around a newly sealed district, German guards and Polish police took their positions, their breath visible in the freezing air. Inside those walls, 460,000 Jewish men, women, and children woke to a new reality. They were now prisoners in the largest ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe, confined to just 2.4% of the city's area. The walls that enclosed them were 10 feet high, topped with barbed wire and broken glass, patrolled by guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to leave. The official food rations allocated to Jewish prisoners were 184 calories per day, less than 1/10 of what a person needs to survive. It was a death sentence by starvation, calculated and deliberate. But the Nazis had not counted on one thing: the courage of children. Over the next 3 years, thousands of boys and girls, some as young as 5 years old, would risk their lives daily to smuggle food into the ghetto, crawling through sewers, scaling walls, and squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for their small bodies. These child prisoners of war became the unlikely heroes who kept an entire community alive. The Warsaw Ghetto was sealed by decree of Governor Ludwig Fischer on October 12, 1940, but preparations had been underway for months. Jewish residents of Warsaw were forced to build the walls that would imprison them, paying for the construction with their own money. The walls snaked through the city for 11 miles, dividing neighborhoods, cutting through the middle of streets, separating families who lived on opposite sides. When the gates finally closed on November 16, the scale of the imprisonment was staggering. Over 30% of Warsaw's population was now confined to a space that represented barely more than 2% of the city's area. Entire families were crammed into single rooms. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded conditions, and hunger, immediate and relentless, became the defining feature of existence behind the walls. The Nazis deliberately engineered starvation as a weapon against the Jewish prisoners. The official rations, distributed on ration cards, told the story clearly. Germans were allocated 2,613 calories per day. Poles received 669 calories, while Jews were given just 184 calories. It was not an oversight or logistical challenge. It was intentional genocide through starvation. The Jewish Council, the Judenrat, appointed by the Germans to administer the ghetto, could not possibly feed the population with such meager allocations. Within weeks of the ghetto's sealing, people began dying of starvation. Children with distended bellies sat on street corners begging. Bodies appeared on sidewalks each morning, covered with newspapers waiting to be collected. By May 1941, Adam Chernyakov, chairman of the Judenrat, wrote in his diary, "Children starving to death." The official death toll climbed rapidly. In 1940, 90 people died of starvation. In 1941, that number reached 11,000. At the peak of the crisis, 500 people were dying each week. It quickly became clear that survival depended on obtaining food from outside the ghetto walls. A black market developed immediately, with prices climbing to astronomical levels. Those who had wealth or valuables could purchase smuggled food, at least for a time. But most ghetto prisoners had nothing. They watched their savings disappear, their belongings sold piece by piece, their bodies weaken day by day. The only solution was smuggling, and children became the primary smugglers, not by choice, but by necessity. Their small size allowed them to slip through openings that adults could not navigate. They could crawl through the sewers that connected the ghetto to the rest of Warsaw. They could squeeze under gaps in the walls, through holes that had been secretly dug, through basement windows of buildings that straddled the ghetto boundary. The children, some as young as 5 years old, became the lifeline between the imprisoned population and survival. 10-year-old Shlomo understood what was at stake every time he left the ghetto. His family had been comfortable before the war, his father a shopkeeper, his mother managing their household. Now they had nothing, and his younger siblings cried from hunger every night. Shlomo was thin, small for his age, which made him perfect for smuggling. Each morning, he would join a group of workers leaving the ghetto for labor assignments on the Aryan side of Warsaw. The guards checked papers at the gates, but they did not always watch carefully. Children could slip through in the confusion, hiding behind adults, moving quickly when the guards were distracted. Once outside, Shlomo would run to contacts his father had arranged, Polish acquaintances who would sell him bread, potatoes, or whatever food they could spare. The prices were high, sometimes 5 or 10 times what the food would have cost before the war. But Shlomo had learned to bargain, to plead, to promise payment later if necessary. The real danger came when returning to the ghetto. The food had to be hidden, carried under clothing, strapped to small bodies, stuffed into pockets and bags. Shlomo would bind bread to his chest with cloth, tie a sack of potatoes around his waist under his shirt, creating a bulky, awkward silhouette that he hoped would not be noticed. The guards at the gate searched people randomly, and those caught smuggling faced severe punishment. But Shlomo had learned to watch for patterns. Some guards were stricter than others. Some could be bribed with a portion of the food or with zloty coins that desperate families scraped together. The Jewish police inside the ghetto were often lenient with child smugglers, understanding that the children were keeping families alive. But the German guards showed no mercy. Shlomo had seen children beaten at the gates, their food confiscated, their small bodies thrown to the ground. He had heard the gunshots that meant another child had been caught and killed. The methods children used to smuggle food were as varied as their desperation demanded. Some climbed the walls using ladders that had been secretly positioned, scrambling up 10 feet of concrete, navigating the barbed wire and broken glass at the top, and then dropping down the other side. The climbs were dangerous, especially in winter when ice made the surfaces slippery and bare hands froze to metal rungs. Children fell, breaking bones, sometimes impaling themselves on the barbed wire, but they climbed anyway, because their families needed to eat. Other children used the sewers, crawling through the filth and darkness to emerge on the Aryan side of Warsaw. The sewers were cramped, filled with rats and waste, but they provided routes that the guards could not easily monitor. Children would hold their breath against the stench, feel their way through the darkness, emerge, covered in filth, but carrying bags of food that meant survival for another few days. Some smuggling happened through buildings that straddled the ghetto wall. These structures, with entrances on both sides, became crucial points for moving goods. Children would enter from the Aryan side, move through basements or back rooms, and emerge on the ghetto side. Building owners or sympathetic Poles sometimes helped, but more often they demanded payment, profiting from the desperation of trapped families. There were also tunnels, dug secretly by adults, that children could navigate more easily. These underground passages required constant maintenance and could collapse without warning. Children crawled through them anyway, pushing sacks of potatoes or flour ahead of them, their small hands raw from scraping against dirt and stone. The risks extended beyond the smuggling itself. German guards entertained themselves by forcing Jews at the checkpoints to perform degrading exercises, making them climb walls repeatedly, do push-ups while holding bricks, or run gauntlets where they were beaten as they passed. Children were not exempted from these cruelties. Guards seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating the smallest prisoners, those who could not effectively fight back or protest. And the threat of death was constant. The proclamation issued by Governor Fisher was explicit. Jews who left the ghetto without authorization were subject to the death penalty, as were any Poles who assisted them. The policy was enforced regularly. Children caught smuggling were shot on sight, their bodies left where they fell as warnings to others. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian who lived in the ghetto and documented everything he witnessed, wrote extensively about the child smugglers in his secret archives. He recorded that dozens of Jewish children between 5 and 6 years old were shot by German guards near the passages and walls. The killings happened so frequently that specific incidents blurred together into a catalog of horror. But Ringelblum noted something else as well. Despite the victims, despite the constant threat of death, the smuggling never stopped for a moment. When one child was killed, another would take their place the next day. The street might still be wet with blood from the previous victim, but other smugglers would already be setting out, having received signals that the way was temporarily clear. The courage was incomprehensible, unless you understood that the alternative was watching your family starve. The poet, Henryka Lazovertuna, captured this reality in her poem The Little Smuggler. Written inside the ghetto in 1941, the poem tells of a small child who supports his starving family by bringing food from the Aryan side, knowing he risks his life every time, but driven by the fear that if he dies, his mother will have nothing to eat. The poem was recited throughout the ghetto, set to music and performed publicly. Ringelblum recorded that listeners were so moved that they proposed erecting a monument after the war to the unknown smuggler, a tribute to all the children who died feeding their families. The monument was never built because the ghetto itself was never liberated. It was liquidated, its population murdered. But the poem survived, and today an excerpt is inscribed on the memorial to the child victims of the Holocaust in Warsaw, serving as an epitaph for the million children murdered in the Holocaust. Not all child smugglers came from poverty. Some families had means, but could not access food through official channels, regardless of their wealth. Renia, a 12-year-old girl from a family of doctors, had never imagined she would become a smuggler. She had attended good schools, taken piano lessons, worn nice dresses. Now she wore rags and risked her life carrying potatoes. Her parents debated sending her out of the ghetto, worried about the danger, but there was no choice. Her younger brother and sister needed to eat. So Rania learned the routes, the timing, the signals that other smugglers used to communicate when the coast was clear. She learned to move silently, to make herself small and inconspicuous, to lie convincingly when questioned. She learned that German soldiers could not be bargained with, but Polish police sometimes looked the other way for a bribe. The work details that left the ghetto each day provided cover for many young smugglers. Thousands of Jews were forced to labor outside the ghetto, working in German factories, clearing rubble, or performing other tasks. These workers were escorted through the gates each morning and returned each evening. Children would blend in with the groups, pretending to be workers or the children of workers. Guards were supposed to verify everyone's papers, but with hundreds passing through the checkpoints, perfect vigilance was impossible. Children exploited these moments of inattention, slipping through when guards were distracted or overwhelmed. Once outside, they had hours to find food before needing to return. Some made contact with Polish families who had been neighbors before the war and who were willing to help. Others dealt with professional smugglers on the Aryan side, middlemen who made fortunes from the desperation inside the ghetto. Professional adult smugglers also operated, some becoming wealthy from the trade. These individuals, both Jewish and Polish, organized large-scale operations, moving not just individual bags of food, but entire trucks full of goods. They bribed officials, established smuggling routes through official gateways, and employed networks of workers. Historian Israel Gutman estimated that about 20,000 people in the ghetto became relatively wealthy through smuggling and other black market activities. This created a grotesque disparity within the imprisoned population. While thousands starved in the streets, the new rich frequented restaurants, cafes, and nightclubs that operated openly in the ghetto. They wore expensive clothes, ate elaborate meals, and seemed to exist in a different reality. To many observers, including Ringelblum, this display of wealth amid starvation was deeply immoral. But the professional smugglers and the wealthy elite were not the ones keeping most families alive. That task fell to the children, the small amateur smugglers who brought in just enough food to delay death for another week. The amounts these children smuggled might seem small, but collectively they were staggering. Historians estimate that between 80 and 97% of all food consumed in the Warsaw Ghetto came through smuggling.
Without this influx of illegal food, the death toll would have been far higher than the approximately 92,000 who died of starvation and disease between 1940 and the start of mass deportations in July 1942. Every bag of potatoes, every loaf of bread, every handful of flour that a child carried through the walls or sewers represented another few days of life for a family. The children were literally bearing the weight of survival on their small shoulders, and they knew it. This knowledge drove them forward, despite their fear, despite the beatings, despite watching other children die. 8-year-old Miriam had been smuggling for 6 months when she was finally caught. She had developed a good routine, leaving each morning through a hole in the basement of a building on Franciscana Street. The hole connected to a cellar on the Aryan side, and she could crawl through in less than a minute. She had built relationships with Polish families who gave her food, sometimes out of compassion, sometimes for payment. On this particular morning, everything seemed normal. She crawled through the hole, collected bread and potatoes from her contacts, and began the return journey. But German guards had been watching the building. As she emerged on the ghetto side, they were waiting. Miriam tried to run, but they caught her immediately. She begged, cried, explained that her mother was sick and her little brother was dying of hunger. The guards showed no reaction. One of them took out his pistol and shot her in front of witnesses who could do nothing to help. They left her body there for hours, a warning to other would-be smugglers.
But the warnings did not work. By afternoon, other children were already using the same route. The hole was too valuable to abandon because of one death. This pattern repeated constantly throughout the ghetto. Guards would catch and kill smugglers at a particular location, and within hours, new smugglers would be using the same spot. The determination was born of absolute necessity. When the choice is between risking death by bullet or accepting death by starvation, many chose to take their chances with the bullets. At least that death would be quick, whereas starvation was prolonged agony that families had to watch helplessly. Not everyone in the ghetto approved of child smuggling. Some parents refused to send their children outside the walls, preferring to starve together rather than risk losing a child to a German bullet. Others felt intense guilt about depending on their children to provide food, a reversal of the natural order where parents protect and provide for children. But desperation erodes principles, and as hunger intensified, more families sent their children out. The children themselves often insisted on going, understanding better than many adults that their small size gave them advantages. They formed networks, sharing information about which routes were currently safe, which guards were most dangerous, where food could be obtained on the Aryan side. The child smugglers developed their own culture, with code words, signals, and unwritten rules about helping each other. Chaim, a 14-year-old boy who had been a good student before the war, organized a group of younger children into a smuggling team. He planned the routes, made contact with suppliers on the Aryan side, and distributed the food they brought back. Chaim took seriously his responsibility for the younger children, always going through the most dangerous passages first to ensure they were safe. He taught them how to move silently, how to recognize danger, how to hide food effectively on their bodies. When one of his group was caught and killed, Chaim took the boy's usual route himself the next day, not wanting the younger children to face that particular spot's danger so soon after a death. He understood that fear could paralyze, and paralysis meant starvation. So he modeled courage, even when he himself was terrified. The smuggling became more sophisticated as time went on. Children learned which guards took bribes, which were absolutely incorruptible, which were sadistic and would kill for entertainment. They learned the timing of guard rotations, the moments when attention was most relaxed, the patterns of patrol schedules. They developed sophisticated hiding places for food, sewing secret pockets into clothing, creating false bottoms in bags, distributing small amounts across multiple people rather than having one person carry everything. When guards began searching more thoroughly, children adapted, finding new routes, new methods, new ways to evade detection. It became an ongoing battle of adaptation, with children constantly innovating to stay ahead of the security measures designed to stop them. Inside the ghetto, the arrival of smuggled food took on a ritualistic importance. Families would wait anxiously for their children to return, unable to relax until they heard the familiar footstep on the stairs, the quiet knock that meant a successful trip. The relief when children returned safely was overwhelming, mixed with the knowledge that tomorrow would require another dangerous journey. Mothers would unwrap the food their children had brought, rationing it carefully to make it last as many days as possible. A loaf of bread might be divided into thin slices, one per day for each family member. Potatoes would be made into watery soup, stretched with whatever other ingredients could be found. Every calorie was precious, every crumb carefully saved. And always there was the knowledge that this food had been purchased by a child's courage, carried at the risk of a child's life. The child smugglers became heroes within the ghetto, though they were rarely celebrated openly. Other prisoners recognized what these children were doing, the risks they took, the maturity they demonstrated. Ringelblum wrote that these child heroes saved or prolonged the lives of countless adults, acting with a courage that seemed impossible given their age. On a funeral for children who had died from hunger, other children from an orphanage placed a wreath with an inscription that captured the tragedy. To the children who have died from hunger, from the children who are hungry. The children understood their situation with a clarity that was heartbreaking. They were prisoners in a war they had not started, facing death from an enemy they could not fight, yet they continued to act with purpose and determination. By 1942, the conditions in the ghetto had deteriorated to catastrophic levels. The official death rate had climbed to over 5,000 per month. Bodies lay in the streets, often for days before being collected. Typhus spread through the overcrowded buildings, killing thousands. Children begging for food were a constant sight on every corner. Despite all the smuggling efforts, despite the courage of thousands of child smugglers, the population was being slowly murdered through deliberate starvation and disease. The official rations of 184 calories per day could not sustain life, and even the smuggled food could not fully compensate for the German policy of genocide through deprivation. Then, on July 22, 1942, everything changed. The Nazis posted notices announcing that nearly all ghetto residents would be deported to the east for resettlement. The child smugglers, who had been risking their lives to feed their families, now faced a different kind of death. The deportations to Treblinka extermination camp began immediately, and within 2 months, over 265,000 people from the Warsaw Ghetto had been murdered in the gas chambers. The children who had smuggled food, who had scaled walls and crawled through sewers, who had faced down armed guards to bring home bread, were herded onto trains with their families. Some tried to hide, using the same skills that had helped them evade guards during smuggling operations. Others fought when they were old enough, joining the resistance organizations that would later lead the Warsaw Ghetto uprising.
The destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto was systematic and total. After the mass deportations of 1942, the resistance fighters who remained staged an uprising in April 1943, but it was crushed by overwhelming German force. The ghetto was razed, its buildings destroyed, its population murdered or scattered to labor camps and other sites of killing. The child smugglers who survived the initial deportations died in Treblinka or in the final destruction of the ghetto. Their bodies were never recovered, their graves never marked. They exist now only in the testimonies of the few survivors, in the archives that Emanuel Ringelblum and his team buried before their own deaths, in the photographs that somehow survived showing small figures climbing over walls with bags strapped to their bodies. Henryka Lazowertówna, the poet who wrote The Little Smuggler, was murdered in Treblinka along with her mother. Her poem survived, preserved by those who had memorized it, recorded in documents that were hidden and later recovered. Today it stands as a memorial to all the children who tried to save their families, who showed courage far beyond their years, who refused to accept starvation passively. The child smugglers of Warsaw chose action over despair, hope over resignation, even when the odds were impossible and death was the most likely outcome. The story of these children reveals something essential about humanity under extreme conditions. When faced with absolute evil, when every structure of civilization has been stripped away, when the powerful have decided that an entire population should die, it is sometimes children who show the clearest moral courage. The adult world had created the circumstances of the ghetto, the policies of starvation, the apparatus of genocide. But it was children who fought back in the most direct way possible, by refusing to let their families die without a struggle. They could not change the political realities that imprisoned them. They could not stop the deportations or prevent the Holocaust, but they could crawl through sewers, climb over walls, and bring back food. And they did, day after day, despite the fear, despite the losses, despite knowing that they might be the next small body left in the street as a warning. The exact number of children who served as smugglers will never be known. Thousands, certainly, perhaps tens of thousands, over the nearly 3 years that the ghetto existed. Many died, shot by guards or killed in other ways. Others survived the smuggling period only to be murdered in the deportations. A handful lived through the war, carrying with them memories of climbing walls at age 7, of watching friends die, of bringing home bread that meant the difference between life and death for their families. These survivors testified after the war about what they had seen and done, ensuring that the story of the child smugglers would not be forgotten. In post-war memorials and histories, the children of the Warsaw Ghetto are sometimes presented as passive victims, innocents caught in events beyond their control or understanding. This narrative, while true in the sense that children bore no responsibility for the war or the Holocaust, misses something crucial about their experience. The child smugglers were not merely victims. They were actors, making choices, taking risks, demonstrating agency in circumstances designed to eliminate all possibility of agency. They assessed danger, planned operations, adapted to changing conditions, supported each other, and persevered in the face of repeated trauma and loss. They were children, yes, but they were also resistance fighters, using the only weapons available to them, their small size, their determination, and their willingness to face death to save others. The child smugglers also experienced the particular trauma of reversed roles. In normal times, children are protected by adults, fed by adults, kept safe by adults. In the Warsaw Ghetto, children fed adults, protected adults through their actions, and often demonstrated more courage and capability than the adults around them. This reversal created psychological wounds that survivors carried for life. They had been forced to grow up instantly, to take on responsibilities no child should bear, to make decisions about life and death before they had finished elementary school. The loss of childhood, combined with the physical dangers and the witnessed deaths, created trauma that could never be fully healed. Yet alongside this trauma was also pride. The children who smuggled food knew they had saved lives. They had looked at impossible odds and refused to give up. They had been braver than they thought possible. In survivor testimonies recorded decades after the war, elderly men and women who had been child smugglers spoke with a complex mixture of pain and satisfaction about their actions. The pain came from the losses, from the memories of friends who died, from the knowledge of how close they themselves had come to death. The satisfaction came from knowing they had fought back, that they had not gone passively to destruction, that their actions had mattered. The story of the Warsaw Ghetto child smugglers also complicates simplistic narratives about rescue during the Holocaust. Much attention, rightly, has been given to people like Irena Sendler, who smuggled thousands of Jewish children out of the ghetto to hiding places on the Aryan side. Sendler's courage and that of others who helped Jews was extraordinary and should be celebrated. But the child smugglers remind us that Jews also rescued themselves, that they did not wait passively for outside rescue, but took action to survive. The children who smuggled food saved far more lives than any individual rescuer could have, though their efforts are less well known because most of them died and could not tell their own stories after the war.
The legacy of the child smugglers raises difficult questions about how we remember the Holocaust. Do we honor victims or heroes? Do we emphasize suffering or resistance? The truth is that the child smugglers were both. They suffered terribly, and most died horrible deaths. They were absolutely victims of Nazi genocide, children who should have been in school and playing with friends, but instead were risking their lives to bring home bread. But they were also heroes who showed remarkable courage, who made conscious choices to act rather than surrender, who saved countless lives through their daily bravery. Any complete memory of the Holocaust must hold both truths simultaneously. In Warsaw today, tourists can visit remains of the Ghetto Wall, preserved as a memorial. They can see the monument to the Ghetto heroes, commemorating the fighters of the 1943 uprising. They can read Lazawertowna's poem at the memorial to child victims. But it is difficult to truly grasp what happened in those streets between 1940 and 1943, to understand the scale of suffering and the depth of courage displayed by people, including children, who are now mostly forgotten names in archives. The child smugglers left few artifacts behind. They had no time to write extensive memoirs while they were struggling to survive. Most of their stories exist only in fragments. A mention in Ringelblum's diary, a line in a survivor's testimony, a photograph of anonymous children climbing a wall. What we do know is this. For nearly 3 years, thousands of children in the Warsaw Ghetto woke up each day and made a choice. They could stay inside the walls, relatively safe, but slowly starving along with their families. Or they could risk death to bring back food. Again and again, they chose risk over safety, action over passivity, hope over despair. Some were caught and killed on their first attempt. Others successfully smuggled food for months or even years before being deported to Treblinka. All of them, whether they survived a week or the entire duration of the ghetto, were child prisoners of war who fought back against their captors in the only way available to them. The term prisoners of war fits the Jewish children of the Warsaw Ghetto in several ways. They were civilians imprisoned by an enemy power during wartime. They were held in conditions designed to cause death through deprivation. They were subject to summary execution without trial. And many of them engaged in resistance activities, smuggling food, that were acts of defiance against their captors' authority. They were not soldiers, had no military training, carried no weapons, but they were warriors nonetheless, fighting a different kind of war with different weapons in a conflict where the enemy sought not just to defeat them, but to eliminate them entirely. The story ends in tragedy, as most Holocaust stories must. The vast majority of the child smugglers were murdered, either shot during their smuggling operations or gassed at Treblinka during the deportations. The families they had worked so hard to feed were murdered alongside them. The ghetto they had tried to sustain through their courage was razed to rubble. The Nazis won in the sense that they succeeded in murdering most of Poland's Jews, including almost all of Warsaw's child children. But the Nazis did not win completely. They could not erase the memory of what these children had done. They could not eliminate the evidence of Jewish resistance and courage, and they could not prevent the few survivors and the documents that were preserved from telling the story to future generations. Today, over 80 years later, we remember the child smugglers of the Warsaw Ghetto not just as victims of genocide, but as heroes who fought for life in the face of death, who showed courage beyond their years, who refused to surrender to the forces that sought to destroy them. Their legacy is not just of suffering, but also of resistance. Not just of death, but of the fierce determination to live and to help others live, even when survival seemed impossible. In a war where 6 million Jews were murdered, where children were specific targets of genocide, where the machinery of death seemed unstoppable, these young prisoners of war in the Warsaw Ghetto climbed walls, crawled through sewers, faced armed guards, and brought home bread. They are heroes of World War II, and their story deserves to be told and remembered alongside all the other stories of courage from that terrible time.